how childhood trauma creates the person you are today. Imagine this: you're 5 years old. Your world is small, mysterious, and filled with questions. You look up to adults for answers, for safety, for love. But what happens when the people meant to protect you become the very source of your fear, confusion, or abandonment? What happens when the environment that's supposed to nurture your growth becomes the place where your identity fractures before it even forms? This is the haunting, often invisible foundation of childhood trauma. And what's even more terrifying is this: it doesn't end in childhood. It follows you, it becomes you. We tend to think of trauma as these massive, cinematic moments: abuse, neglect, violence. And yes, those are real and devastating. But trauma can also be silent. It can be the absence of validation. It can be growing up in a home where no one saw you, really saw you. It can be a parent who never said, "I'm proud of you." A sibling who always got the attention, while you learned to be invisible to survive. Trauma is not always what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result. But here's the philosophical dilemma: if we are shaped by trauma, then who are we really? Are we the product of pain, or do we have the power to transcend it? This question is not just psychological, it's existential. Because when you begin to examine your present behaviors, your fears, your relationship patterns, your perfectionism, your self-sabotage, you start to see that they are not random. They are echoes. Echoes of a younger version of you trying to feel safe in a world that once felt dangerous. And most of us have no idea this is even happening. Have you ever wondered why you get triggered in certain situations that seem minor to others? Why you shut down when someone raises their voice? Why you can't take a compliment without deflecting? Why you chase people who abandon you or push away the ones who stay? These are not flaws. These are survival codes. They were written into your nervous system when you were too young to know better. And they are still running in the background of your adult life, like an outdated operating system you never chose but can't seem to uninstall.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
But here's the twist: trauma doesn't just damage, it defines. It gives shape to your story. And in that painful shaping, something strange happens. It gives you depth. It gives you emotional intelligence. It gives you the capacity to feel deeply, to understand others, to become someone who sees what others miss. The very thing that once made you feel broken can become the foundation of your wisdom, your creativity, even your purpose. But only if you're willing to confront it. Only if you're willing to stop running. Let me ask you this: who are you when you're not trying to survive? Because most of us are still living from the strategies we developed as children, strategies that helped us then, but hurt us now. People-pleasing, perfectionism, emotional withdrawal, hyper-independence. These are not personality traits. These are defense mechanisms. And the moment you realize that, your entire reality begins to shift. You stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking what happened to me. And that question is the key to your liberation. Now, I know this is heavy, but this is also where the light begins to enter. But because you can change, you can rewire. You can become someone new. Neuroplasticity is real. Healing is real. But it begins with awareness. With facing the truth of your childhood, not to blame, but to understand, not to dwell, but to reclaim. Because here's the thing: your trauma may explain your behavior, but it doesn't excuse your future. You are not responsible for what happened to you, but you are responsible for what you do with it now. Childhood trauma creates the architecture of your identity. It builds the walls you hide behind, but it also shows you where the exits are. If you trace the pain, you'll find the map. You'll begin to see how every trigger is a teacher. Every fear is a flashlight. Every breakdown is a doorway. The question is, will you walk through it? What if your greatest wounds were not the end of your story, but the beginning of your becoming? What if the version of you that survived childhood was just the seed and the real you has yet to bloom? The subconscious blueprint, how childhood trauma programs your adult behavior. There's a silent architect within each of us, and it starts drafting the blueprint of who we'll become long before we're aware it's even happening. This architect is your subconscious, and childhood trauma is often the first ink it uses to design the framework of your adult identity. What's terrifying is that these foundational plans are drawn not in logic, but in emotion survival, in moments of confusion, fear, or pain that you couldn't process as a child, so your brain did something miraculous and dangerous at the same time. It buried the experience but kept the lesson. And that lesson, often distorted by the mind of a child, becomes your unspoken law. A law that governs your behavior, your choices, your relationships, and even your self-worth. Imagine being 7 years old and watching your parents fight. You feel invisible, or worse, like it's your fault. You don't yet have the language or emotional maturity to say, "This isn't about me." So instead, your subconscious decides, love is loud. Love is unstable. I must be quiet to stay safe. That belief gets stored, not as a memory, but as a rule. And 20 years later, you find yourself unable to speak up in relationships, terrified of conflict, always deferring to others. And you don't know why, but your subconscious does. It's just following the blueprint. This is where philosophy and neuroscience collide. Philosophically, we've wrestled for centuries with the question of human freedom. Are we truly autonomous, or are we just products of our conditioning? The answer is both uncomfortable and empowering. We are programmed, but we are not imprisoned. We are influenced by our past, but we are not doomed to repeat it if we become conscious of the programming. And that's where real transformation begins. You have to understand that your behavior is not random. It is procrastination, addiction, emotional unavailability, chronic anxiety. These are not character flaws. They are adaptations. They are strategies you once used to protect yourself from a world that felt unsafe. But those strategies, while once necessary, are now outdated. They are the walls of a childhood fortress you no longer live in, but you've forgotten how to leave. Your brain wired itself for survival, not happiness. And until you rewire it, you will keep calling your trauma personality. Let me ask you something. What parts of your life feel like they're on loop? The same fights, the same heartbreak, the same inner critic repeating the same cruel lines. That repetition is not coincidence. It's code. It's your subconscious reminding you that something old is still running the show. And it will keep running until you pause and rewrite the script. But how do we do that? How do we break free from a blueprint we didn't choose? The answer isn't easy, but it's simple. We become radically honest. We trace our behaviors back to their origin. We ask ourselves not just what we're doing, but why. Why do I shut down when someone gets too close? Why do I feel worthless after success? Why does love make me anxious? These are not surface questions, they're excavations. They dig through the foundation of your subconscious and begin to unearth the original wound. And here's the most profound part. When you recognize the wound, you gain power over it. The moment you see the blueprint is the moment you can start redrawing it. You can choose new beliefs, new habits, new ways of relating to others and yourself. You can start building a life that's designed for who you are now, not who you had to be then. So many of us are living in houses built from fear, shame, and silence. But you can renovate. You can tear down the inner walls that keep you small. You can install windows where there were none, let light in where there was once only shadow. You are not your trauma. You are the architect now. Emotional echoes, how childhood pain shapes your relationships and self-worth. Every time you get close to someone, something ancient stirs within you. It's not just attraction or connection, it's the echo of your earliest emotional experiences, whispering their scripts into the present. We often think our adult relationships are built on logic, choice, and maturity. But more often than not, they're built on echoes of how love felt when we were too young to understand it, echoes of what we learned to expect from the people who were supposed to care for us. And those echoes shape not only how we relate to others, but how we relate to ourselves. If you grew up in a home where affection was inconsistent or conditional, you may have learned to chase love, to overextend, to morph yourself into what others wanted, fearing that if you didn't, love would disappear. If you had caregivers who were emotionally distant or unpredictable, you may have developed a hyper-awareness of others' moods, a skill that protected you then, but now leaves you exhausted in relationships. You're not just reacting to the present, you're reacting to a pattern your nervous system memorized long ago. And unless you become aware of it, you will confuse familiarity with safety, repeating the same emotional dynamics over and over, even when they hurt. Your self-worth is a mirror of your early emotional environment. If you were praised only when you performed, you may now tie your value to achievement. If you were criticized for your emotions, you may now see vulnerability as weakness. If you were ignored, you may now struggle to believe you're worthy of attention without earning it. These beliefs aren't just thoughts, they're identities. They become the lens through which you see every relationship, every opportunity, every failure. And worst of all, they're often invisible. You don't realize you're carrying them. You just assume that's who you are. But let's pause here and ask something deeper. When did you first learn that love had to be earned? When did you first decide that your needs were too much? Who told you, either with words or silence, that your worth was conditional? These questions aren't meant to blame. They're meant to uncover. Because once you understand where your emotional echoes come from, you can begin to challenge them. You can begin to separate the past from the present. You can begin to choose relationships that reflect your healing, not your wounding. And this is where the real power emerges. When you start to heal the emotional blueprint of your childhood, your relationships begin to change. You stop choosing people who re-traumatize you. You stop abandoning yourself to keep others around. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You learn to sit with discomfort without betraying yourself. You learn to speak your truth, not because you want to control others, but because you finally believe your voice matters. This isn't just personal growth, it's liberation. Healing childhood trauma is not about revisiting the past endlessly. It's about recognizing how the past shows up in the present and then doing the courageous work of responding differently. That's how emotional echoes begin to fade. Not by silence, but by conscious choice, by rewriting the script, by becoming the adult you needed back then. So ask yourself, are your relationships a reflection of your healing or your history? Do you show up as your true self, or as the version of you that once had to survive? The answers to those questions may be uncomfortable, but they are the beginning of everything. Breaking the cycle, transforming childhood trauma into conscious power. There comes a moment, quiet, subtle, but undeniable, when you realize that the cycle doesn't have to continue. That the pain you inherited does not have to be the pain you pass on. That the survival patterns you adopted as a child are not life sentences, but invitations. Invitations to become conscious, to become intentional, to become powerful in a way that no longer depends on control, fear, or avoidance, but on truth. This is the moment where healing becomes transformation, where trauma is no longer just something you survived, but something you alchemized into wisdom, strength, and conscious power. The greatest lie trauma tells us is that we are powerless, that we are stuck, that the damage is permanent and the past is destiny. But that lie only survives in silence. The moment you name your patterns, the moment you trace your behaviors back to their roots, the illusion begins to collapse. You realize that you are not broken, you are conditioned, and conditioning can be rewired. But it takes work, it takes presence, it takes the willingness to feel what you once buried and to act in ways that your younger self never had the privilege to. Breaking the cycle starts with awareness, but it doesn't end there. It moves into action, into showing up differently, and into choosing discomfort over numbness, into having the hard conversation instead of shutting down, into saying no when your trauma tells you to say yes just to be liked, into saying yes when your fear begs you to stay small. It's in these micro moments that transformation lives, not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in daily decisions that slowly shift the direction of your entire life. You begin to realize that power isn't about dominance, control, or perfection. It's about presence. It's about being fully here, fully honest, and fully responsible for your experience. It's about no longer outsourcing your worth to people who remind you of your wounds, but no longer chasing validation from those who were never capable of giving it. You reclaim the energy that was once spent on survival and redirect it toward creation of boundaries, of peace, of purpose. And this shift doesn't just change you, it ripples outward. When you heal, you stop bleeding on people who didn't cut you. You stop reenacting the pain that was passed down to you. You become the interruption. The one who says, "It ends with me." That doesn't mean you never struggle again. It means you struggle consciously, with compassion, and with tools your younger self never had. You become the adult you once needed, and in doing so, you give your inner child a home they never had, your own heart. Let's ask something radical. What if your trauma wasn't just something to overcome, but something that uniquely qualifies you to become who you were always meant to be? What if your deepest wounds were actually spiritual initiations, designed not to destroy you, but to awaken you? That doesn't justify the pain. It doesn't excuse the people who hurt you. But it does give you a choice to let that pain harden you, or to let it carve you into something softer, wiser, more awake. Because here's the truth: pain that is not transformed is transmitted. If you don't deal with your trauma, it will deal with you. It will show up in your relationships, your work, your parenting, your dreams. But when you face it, when you meet it with compassion and courage, it becomes something else. And it becomes power. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that radiates. The kind that walks into a room and makes people feel safe. The kind that leads not from ego, but from empathy. You didn't choose your trauma, but you do choose what you do with it now. You can choose to perpetuate it, or you can choose to become the person who breaks the cycle. That choice is the most profound act of self-love and world change you will ever make. So the real question is this: now that you know you're holding the pen, how will you write the next chapter?